All right, let's dive right in. We're going to tackle a massive question today. How do laws actually get made in America? And I'll tell you right now, it's way more complicated and honestly, way more interesting than what they probably taught you back in school.
So how does a bill become a law? You've heard that a million times, right? I bet some of you can even hear that little tune from Schoolhouse Rock in your head right now. You know the one. And it all seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it?
And yeah, this is the textbook answer we all learned. Congress drafts something up, it passes the House and the Senate, and then boom, the president signs it. Done. And look, that's definitely true. But it is absolutely not the whole story. Not even close.
See, the reality is that a huge chunk of the rules that affect our daily lives, rules that have the full force of law, are made completely outside of that classic process. So today we're going to open up the other toolkits, the ones the president uses, the ones government agencies use, and yeah, even the ones the courts use to write the rules we all have to follow.
Okay, let's start at the top, the president's office. The executive branch has some seriously powerful tools for making policy all on its own without waiting for Congress to send over a bill. And the one you've probably heard of the most is the executive order. Basically, the Constitution says the president has to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So an executive order is a formal command from the president to the federal government telling them how to do that. And make no mistake, these aren't just suggestions, they are legally binding. But, and this is a huge but, that power has limits. A president can't just write an executive order that goes against the Constitution or a law that Congress has already passed. It's a classic case of checks and balances, you know? The courts can step in and say, nope, that's unconstitutional, or a new Congress can just pass a law to cancel it out.
All right, now let's talk about a real power-up, national emergencies. When a president declares one, guess how many special powers they suddenly get access to? 10? Maybe 50? The answer is more than 120. We're talking a massive expansion of authority here, everything from freezing assets to deploying the military.
And you know what? These emergencies can stick around for a long time. I mean, think about it. The national emergency that was declared right after the 9/11 attacks, it's been renewed every single year by every single president since 2001. It's still active today, granting the government all sorts of national security powers.
Now, switching gears to foreign policy, there's another really interesting distinction. You have treaties, which need a 2/3 yes vote from the Senate, and let me tell you, that is a very high hurdle to clear. But then you have something called executive agreements, and the key difference? They don't need the Senate's approval, so you can see why a president might prefer to use them for everything from trade deals to military agreements. It's just easier. Okay, so that's the president. But there's this other, enormous source of lawmaking power that's kind of hidden in plain sight. All those federal agencies. You know, the EPA, the FDA, OSHA. Think of them as the people who write the super detailed rulebooks for the entire country. Here's how it works. Congress will pass a big, broad law. Something like, let's have clean air, or make workplaces safe. But they don't get into the nitty-gritty. They leave the details to the experts at the agencies. This whole process is called agency rulemaking. And it's how we get the super specific regulations on everything from how much mercury is allowed in the water to what kind of hard hat you need on a construction site. And again, these rules are law. Now, there is a formal process for this, laid out in something called the Administrative Procedure Act. An agency puts out a proposed rule, and then you, the public, actually get a chance to submit comments on it. Then the agency is supposed to review those comments before publishing the final rule. So there's some public input, but it's a far cry from a big public debate on the floor of the House or Senate. So that raises a pretty big question, right? How much power can Congress just give away to an agency? Well, the Supreme Court weighed in on this a long time ago, back in 1928. They came up with something called the non-delegation doctrine. It basically says Congress can't just throw its hands up and say, you figure it out. They have to provide what's called an intelligible principle, some kind of clear guidance for the agency to follow.
And more recently, the courts have put another check on the table. It's called the Major Questions Doctrine. What the Supreme Court has basically said, like in that big West Virginia versus EPA case, is that if an agency is going to make a rule that has a massive economic or political impact, they can't just point to some vague language in a 50-year-old law. They need Congress to have given them clear, specific permission to do it.
Okay, so we've talked about the president and the agencies. But what about Congress itself? Are they just stuck passing bills the old-fashioned way? Oh no. They have their own toolkit for shaping policy that has nothing to do with writing a brand new law. And their toolkit is pretty powerful. For one, there's the Congressional Review Act. This lets them basically hit the delete button on a new rule from an agency they don't like.
They can also sneak little riders into budget bills that say, hey, EPA, you're not allowed to spend any money on this particular thing. And you can never, ever forget the power of a big televised oversight hearing to put pressure on people, or the Senate's power to approve or block whoever the president wants to.
All right, that brings us to the final piece of this puzzle, the courts, the judicial branch. And it's so important to remember that courts don't just interpret the law. In a very real way, they shape it, and sometimes they even create it. Their ultimate power, their superpower really, is something called judicial review. It all goes back to a famous old case, Marbury versus Madison. This is the power for a court to look at a law passed by Congress or an action taken by the president and say, sorry, this violates the Constitution, so it's void. It is the ultimate check on everybody else.
So you see what's happening here. You've got all these different gears turning at the same time. You have executive orders from the president, you have rules from the agencies, you have oversight from Congress, and you have judicial review from the courts. It's all part of this incredibly complex, interlocking system. And this chart really lays it all out, right? The president uses executive orders, but the courts and Congress can push back. The agencies write the detailed rules, but guess who's looking over their shoulder? The courts and Congress. Congress has its oversight powers, but the president can sometimes fight back with something called executive privilege, which is basically their right to keep some conversations private. And even the courts, with their power of judicial review, are ultimately limited by the words of the Constitution itself.
So here's the main takeaway, the most important thing to remember. All this complexity, all this overlap, it's not an accident. It's the whole point. The framers of the Constitution didn't want a system where everything was neat and tidy. They wanted a system where the branches were constantly getting in each other's way, checking each other's power. It's a feature, not a bug. It's all designed to make sure no single part of the government can run away with all the power.
And that brings us to the big, final question for you to think about. This whole system, by its very design, chooses checks and balances over speed. It's meant to be slow. It's meant to be messy. So in our world today, a world that moves incredibly fast and faces really urgent problems, is that deliberate slowdown still a strength? Or has it maybe become a weakness?